Okay, this quick video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the reshape command and also just some general other tips as far as how to get your data nice, clean, and organized and into a Stata data set. And that way you can run regressions and do all the fancy things you want to do inside of Stata. I'm also going to utilize the World Bank Open Data to illustrate these points. This is an extremely popular data set that students often use in their research. It has data on most countries and has data across tons and tons of different concepts and areas, and economic data and health data and environmental data, all sorts of good stuff. The data set that we're going to use for this particular example is just going to be CO2. You'll notice that when you put CO2 into the Open Bank search, you get a lot of different options. We're just going to go with kilotons of CO2 emissions. The World Bank Open Data website's great because you can look at some interesting data visuals right off the bat. This is worldwide CO2 emissions since 1960. You can go through and you can click on individual countries to see what their lines look like. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just download this data immediately. And so I'm just going to go ahead and click Excel here because Excel is probably the easiest to get into Stata. You could download CSV or XML files. There's also ways to get those into Stata, but let's just, most students are used to Excel and we'll be using Excel. So let's use that. So I already have this Excel file open. And so when you download the Excel file from the World Bank Open Data, actually the way you normally see it is this. It opens up to this particular tab. If you just click over to the data tab, you'll actually see where the data is. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a simple copy and paste of this data into Stata because it's the sort of most straightforward way. If I were to import this particular data into Stata, I would probably want to clean it up a little bit before I did that, get rid of some of these extraneous rows that I don't need for the data set, or I could actually use some specialized commands to get this data into Stata and take care of these particular rows if I wanted to. But again, copy and pasting is easy and it works, and we're just going to go for it in this video. So I have the data set highlighted. You'll notice that I take care not to highlight every single row and every single column. Sometimes students do that. They'll just click that upper left-hand corner button. It'll highlight the entire worksheet, and then they'll copy and paste it into Stata. It actually causes problems because it creates observations which are essentially blank. So you'll notice that I have exactly the data set copied or highlighted here, and then I'm just going to copy it. And then I'm going to open up Stata, and I'm going to clear my existing work. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just paste this data right into the Stata data editor. Now you notice a couple things when I do this. First off, oftentimes when you paste data into Stata, it will give you an option of referring to this first row as variable names. I noticed that with the World Bank Open Data, for whatever reason, it doesn't typically give me that option. I'm not sure why, but this is not a problem. It's certainly something we can easily work around. But you want to make note, of course, of what these column titles are, and especially the years, and we'll see why that matters here in just a moment. And so what I would normally do at this point is I would actually go through and I would rename variables. I would call variable 1 country name, variable 2 country code, and then before I moved on. But before I do that, I'm actually going to get rid of these two variables. They're not necessary. You can see they're just indicator codes for that particular data in that particular country. We don't really need this. So I'm just going to get rid of this data. You can do that through the command file, the command prompt, or you can do it just by highlighting and selecting drop, select the data, yes, and then it'll get rid of it right there for you. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out of the data editor, and I'm going to rename those variables. So I'm going to rename variable 1 country. I'm going to rename variable 2 code. So I go back to the data editor, and we can see now that this is country, this is code. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to get rid of this particular row. But again, make sure that you note how the years work here. Or if this is, some other observation, perhaps it's quarterly data or biannual data, whatever, make sure you note what these are. And you'll see how this information allows us to actually use the reshape command in a fairly efficient way. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this row here. Yep. All right. So now we see that we have country, we have code, and then we have the annual observations essentially listed as var 5. var 5 is 1960, var 6 is 1961, so on and so forth. And again, that's really important. We're going to use that that knowledge to our advantage here in just a moment. So as I previously mentioned in class, this is what we call wide data. Wide data means that the observations by time period are represented as individual columns, and they are, instead of being stacked, they are set beside each other. So this is wide data. What we need is we need these columns to in fact be stacked on top of each other. Because in order to run regressions and things like that in Stata, that's the format that it needs to be in, what we call long. Okay, so let me back out of this. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to start our reshape command. Reshape. Now you type in reshape, and then this is where you type either long or wide. We are taking our data from wide into long, so we want to reshape our data long. And then the way that the reshape command works is it uses a stub and then the stub number. So in this particular example, the stub is var, V-A-R, which stands for variable, and then the stub number is 5. Okay, so just var is the stub. So whenever we're doing a reshape, we put reshape long and then the stub. And this will tell Stata that this is the specific columns of data that we want to stack in order to take our wide data and turn it into long data. So reshape long var, and then the rest of the code works like this. This represents the entity level data. So this is what you're going to put here is country. Because we have two indicators, although they're the exact same, it's often helpful just to go ahead and throw in that other indicator into the I variable. You will always put I here. So the code specifically is I, and then whatever the unique identifier is. Here, there's two unique identifiers. They're the same thing, but it just helps us a little bit. It keeps things a little bit more straightforward. And then J, and then for reshape long, we actually just leave it as J. Okay. So in the long command, what we're doing is we're replacing the I with the unique identifier, and we're leaving the J variable as J. If we were doing reshape wide, this would be a little bit different. And because reshape wide is not very useful to us in this course, it's not something that I typically go over. Although once you get used to the reshape long command, reshaping wide is fairly straightforward. So I'm going to hit enter here, and Stata is going to do its work. And now when I go to the data editor, what I notice is just as I wanted it to be. I wanted the variable, which again, this is CO2 emissions. I wanted them to be in long form, and we certainly have that now. You'll notice we have our countries as a column, and we have observations of CO2 emissions also as a column. We have a couple more steps to do. First off, we know that J here represents years, and specifically that this is 1960 rather. This is 1961. This is 1962, so on and so forth. And so what I want to do is I want to rename this variable to be year, and I also want to convert this variable back into years. And to do this, we're just going to do a little bit of a brute force thing, but again, it's important for us to remember where the data started. We saw previously that the data started in 1960, so we know that J5 here refers to 1960, J6 here refers to 1961, so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to generate a variable called year, which is going to equal to J plus, and then if we put 1955, what this is going to do, it's going to take that observation for J and it's going to add 1,955 to it. Well, we know that when J is 5, that refers to 1960. And we know when J is 6, that refers to 1961. So if you take 5 and you add it to that, that would give you 1960. And if you took 6 and added it to 1955, you would, of course, get 1961. So all we have to do to take that variable and convert it into our proper years is to remember where our data set started as far as years is confirmed, and that's 1960. And then just pay attention to the stub number and where it starts. The stub number here started at 5, so in order to convert that to 1960, I simply add 1955 to it. Now, if I go to my data editor, I'll see that I have a year variable, which starts precisely when I want it to start and carries through to the entire time series in my panel. Now the J variable is redundant. We can get rid of it if we want to, and we still want to rename this variable as well. So we will drop J. We will rename var CO2, because that's the observations are CO2 emissions. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just reorder the data to put it into a little bit more of a logical format. I'm going to order country, code, year, and CO2. And this will just give it a nice sort of visual look. And so when I do this, and I go back to the data editor, now we can see that I have this nice, pretty data set. I have, Afghanistan's 1960 CO2 emissions. And as you can see, this gigantic panel of CO2 emissions captures nearly every country on Earth and captures their CO2 emissions. In the next video, what I'm going to show you is once we have more than one of these data sets, how we can then combine them. And so you can start adding more variables to this. So maybe you want to put in sulfur dioxide emissions and GDP data. So we'll show that in the next video.